Hot on the heels of my video last week looking at the Big Chief Studios Live and Let Die solitaire figure, today I'm going to turn my attention to Baron Samedi. I've always had great affection for this character and his visual look and style, and he's very different from any of the other Bond villains that we see in the film franchise. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time we've had a figure made of this character, certainly in the 1/6 scale. So there's quite a lot to go through, so without further ado, I'll make a start with the packaging. Now, you may recognise the packaging. It is very similar to what we saw with Solitaire. It is essentially this grayscale packaging. There's not an awful lot of imagery or colour on this packaging. We have, of course, the gun barrel, and we have an image of the figure itself in the centre of that gun barrel, which looks pretty cool. I do really love this lettering, though. I think the metallic lettering is really, really nice, and I do love the knife representing the eye in the logo there. I think that's really cool, particularly with that red handle. It's very visually striking, and then, of course, it catches the light beautifully. So although this is quite simple packaging, I still think it's quite visually striking, even though there's not an awful lot of colour to it. Now, this is quite a big chunky box, so on the side panel we have an opportunity here to have some real nice imagery to put on display when we put it on a shelf. They've opted for a photograph of the figure itself. I think this is really cool, looks really striking, and then again we have that in grayscale and the wonderful metallic lettering. On the flip side we have a different image, and again looks really, really good. I think if you stack this up with the other figures, particularly from this line, if we think about the Solitaire and of course Roger Moore's James Bond, then these stack together very nicely. The reverse of the packaging is pretty consistent with what we've seen so far. Again, we have another photograph of the figure posed really very well. It is in grayscale, and of course we have that metallic lettering, and we have a little bit of information about the character, a bit of a bio there at the bottom of the box. Again, in terms of presentation, I think this looks really, really good, and whilst it's not the most colourful, I still think there's a visual style here that is actually quite appealing on display. Of course, when we remove the outer sleeve of the packaging, underneath we are presented with this fantastic cardboard inlay, and finally we have a splash of colour, and I think this looks really, really nice. So these are some of the images we've already seen on the packaging outside, but of course in full colour this time, and very nicely stylised in terms of the photography, and displaying the figure in lots of versatile different poses, and of course highlighting some of his accessories and features as well. So this looks very, very nice on its own, but of course it is double-sided, so when we flip it over, we have what is basically a diorama for the character to stand in. We have this scene created behind him, and I love these. I'm a huge fan of this approach. I think it just really finishes off these figures when they're on display and just gives them a bit more of a world to live in and a bit more colour and vibrancy. Now, the first thing I'd say about this figure, much like the Solitaire, is that instantly, as soon as you open this packaging up, the figure is visually very, very striking, and a lot of that is down to the costume. And if we take a look at this first head sculpt, because there are two heads in this packaging, I think it's fair to say they've nailed the likeness of the actor Geoffrey Holder. I think they've done a fantastic job. This is eerily accurate in my opinion, and I think the thing that really stands out about this sculpt in my opinion is the eyes, because of course the sculpt is fantastic, but the paint apps are wonderful, and there's something about these eyes in particular with the way they catch the light that seem very, very lifelike and slightly eerie. I think they've done an incredible job with this. I think they've done a pretty excellent job in terms of the tailoring, in terms of the look of this outfit. It's very reminiscent of what we see on screen. Interestingly, the material they've used for the outfit is a sort of plastic, silky satin. It's kind of difficult to articulate, really, when it comes to the materials they've used, because it does have this very silky, satin-like appearance, but at the same time there's a sort of plastic quality to it. It's a little bit stiff. There obviously are wires inside to make sure you can pose it in various ways, which is great. The inner lining is wonderful magenta colour, which I really like, but as I said, it does have that kind of plastic quality to it at the same time, whilst being very soft and textured to the touch. Now, interestingly, the torso is actually made of a rubber material, which is very effectively done. Of course, it hides any unseemly joints that we might see on other figures, and I think this might be one of the first times we've seen this in the Bond line of 1/6 scale figures from Big Chief Studios. I think this looks really, really good. It's very lifelike. It definitely looks like skin, and it definitely creates the right appearance, which I think is fantastic. Now, in terms of that loincloth, that is a sort of felt kind of material. Again, it certainly looks the part, and the necklace that he's wearing there is obviously one of his accessories. One of the things I think that works really well with this necklace, though, is that it is made up of individual beads. I think that's really, really cool. The Cross itself is just a sort of flimsy plastic, unfortunately. It would have been nice if it had been a slightly denser material, a bit more weighted so it falls flat to his chest. As it is, there is a tendency for it to want to sort of like pop up and pull free of the torso there. But if you persevere, you can get it into place and make it look pretty good. Now, the one criticism I would have is of the collar. The collar itself is very nicely done. Again, it is posable, it has a wire in it, so you can do different things with it. But if we look at photos from the film, it looks to be slightly out of scale. The collar looks a lot bigger, a lot more floppy in the film than it appears on this figure. Unless, of course, I am mistaken and he has two different outfits in the film. One has a short collar and one has a longer one. That is entirely possible. I haven't seen the film for a while, and I certainly haven't picked up on that detail if that is the case. Now, the figure does come with a number of hands, which we'll look at a little bit later, but I just want to point out they are made of rubber, but actually quite sturdy this time around. I think these are a lot better than we saw with Solitaire's hands. I think these are really beautifully sculpted, and again, we have some wonderful detail when it comes to the rings in particular. The way they're painted, the skin tone on the back of the hand and on the palm of the hands is different, exactly as it should be, and this looks really, really nicely rendered. Now, one of the things that gave me pause when I saw the early production photos of this figure was the plastic legs. Obviously, they've not opted to give him the rubber skin over these legs, so when it comes to the knee joints, you can really see the gap between them quite clearly and quite plainly. That said, though, in the flesh, it's really not as noticeable as you might first think. I definitely think this is something that was highlighted by the photographs, but in the flesh, it's really not too noticeable at all. It's not too bad. I actually think it works perfectly well. However, I have to admit the ankle joints fare less well. These are a lot more obvious and they do stick out a little bit. Obviously, it's a difficult call to make when it comes to wanting the maximum articulation but at the same time want to have the best presentation. I think they've compromised and it doesn't quite work. It's a very difficult one to pull off successfully, I think. That said, it's not massive, but it is something that you're probably going to notice. Now, he does, of course, come with the standard base that we've seen on the other James Bond figures in this line. He does come with his own nameplate on frosted glass or frosted plastic, and of course, when this slides into place, it is lit up by the LED lights underneath, which are activated by touching the base on either side. As always, I think this is really nice and very effective. I think this lights up beautifully and is a really nice approach, but my constant criticism would be I would always rather these lights were on the actual base of the figure, so they uplit the figure when they're on display. Now, the articulation is a little bit different to what we've seen in other figures. He does have a ball joint in the head, of course, but notice it's not in the neck. We don't have that joint in the neck there. This time, all of the movement is coming from the top of the head itself. And as such, there isn't as great a range of motion as we're used to seeing on some of the other figures in this line. But he can move his head all the way around. He can nod it up and down and lean it from left to right a little bit as well. Now, of course, he does have ball joints in the shoulder, so he can lift his arms up and out, and he can bring them forwards and backwards as you would expect, which is good stuff. He also has joints in the upper bicep and, of course, in the elbow there, so he can bend his arms a pretty healthy distance back. Of course, always be mindful of the costume and the limitations of the material that's there. Now, he does have a ball joint in the wrist, so he can bend his hand forwards and backwards and rotate it 360 degrees as well. Now, in the torso, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of articulation at all. There is a swivel at the waist, so he can spin from side to side, but there is sadly no articulation in the ab area to allow him to bend forwards or backwards. It is really relying on the joints in the thighs and in the hips. Of course, he does have ball joints in the hips, so his legs can kick out to the side. There is also an upper thigh swivel, and I have to say on mine, this one is a little bit loose actually, a little bit disconcerting, but the legs kick forwards, and of course, they kick backwards as well. There's a pin swivel at the knee, allowing the leg to bend to roughly 90 degrees, and of course, spin from side to side, and then we have that ball joint in the ankle as well, again, allowing that foot to rotate all the way around, and of course, hinge from left to right, or hinge forwards and backwards as well. And as you would expect from Big Chief Studios, he does come loaded with extra goodies, including an additional 4 pairs of hands, each one distinctly different from the other. I really love the variety that we have here in some of the more flamboyant and more interesting hand gestures that we have in this set. I think they're fantastic. He also comes with an extra pair of feet, again, very novel. I don't think I've seen that before. An alternate head, which I absolutely love this, and we'll look at that a bit closer in a moment. We also have his cross on his necklace there, which we've already seen, and he also has this flute weapon as well. But that's not all, because he also has his walking cane and his top hat. And if you shelled out for the special commemorative edition, then you would also have had the mini voodoo hat as well. Now, I did say I wanted to take a closer look at this fantastic alternate head. I love this. This is my personal preference of the two sculpts. I just love the sculpt on this. I think it's fantastic. Just as before, very, very well sculpted, beautifully painted, but we have just so much more detail here with this open yellow mouth. It looks absolutely eerie, creepy, just as it does in the film, which is brilliant. But just look at the detailing on the teeth and the gums and the tongue there. Wow, just really, really impressive. I have to say, I absolutely love the accessories on this figure, perhaps more than any other Bond figure that I have in my collection, just because they're so distinct and different and interesting, and no matter what you do with them, it always looks visually just really eye-catching. And I'm really pleased to say that despite his hands being made of rubber, he has no problems gripping some of the accessories the way that, say, the Solitaire figure did. This is a nice tight grip, and he can hold virtually all of his accessories with no issues whatsoever, and they look absolutely fantastic. I also really wanted to show off his flute because I think this is fantastic. It's a nice sculpt, pretty accurate to what we see on screen, but of course it also has that wonderful functionality, doubling as that weapon there, so of course it does extend and we can see the blowpipe coming out of the bottom there, which I think is really, really cool. Again, he has no problems holding this whatsoever and just looks really striking. So as I say, I love the visual look of this figure. That's what it's all about ultimately. When you put him on display, he looks incredible. Of course, it looks even better once we put that backdrop behind him as well, that display there. I think this figure really pops and comes to life at this point. I really love the backdrop they've chosen for this, being in the jungle with the flames. It just really sets the scene, literally, and it looks really, really good. I have to say, in terms of my final thoughts, I think this actually might be my favourite figure of the three that I've looked at so far. James Bond from Dr. No, Solitaire from Live and Let Die, of course. I do think that this one is just really, really visually brilliant and eye-catching, and all of the accessories feel really meaningful. It feels like you can do an awful lot with them in terms of display, and they're really just made for that. Of course, that doesn't mean that this figure is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's definitely issues when it comes to hiding some of the joints, particularly on the ankles, which is disappointing. And I'm still slightly ambivalent about that collar as well. But other than that, I have to say, I really love this figure. And as I say, he's probably my favourite from Big Chief Studios so far. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.